Good morning, everyone. In the interest of time, we will go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning. My name is Lisa Cote, and I'm the Assistant Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the Office of Diversity and Community Engagement. Being Indigenous in Connecticut is presented by the University of Hartford UIS program and the Office of Diversity and Community Engagement, as well as the Noah Webster House and West Hartford Historical Society. We are very lucky to have two amazing speakers with us today, and I will turn this over in just a second to Judy to let her introduce them. But in addition to this being for a class, this is also to help our university honor and celebrate Native American Heritage Month, which happens in November every year. So thank you all for joining us and for being here to learn. And I will hand it over to Judy Kelly now.
So hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today, adding to Lisa's thank yous. And I'm so pleased to be able to introduce Sage Phillips and Mixashawn Rozie to you. Today, I just want to tell you a little bit about the format. The event will last for about an hour. Each speaker will talk for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll have questions and answers. And you put those questions into the Q&A box. You won't be able to see questions that other people have put in, and you won't be able to chat with other people. So just to let you know, and you can put those questions in throughout the event while both speakers are talking, and then I will moderate after they're done. So first I want to introduce Sage Phillips, our first speaker. And she's a young Penobscot woman of the Wabanaki people. She's a student at UConn currently. She's made it her mission to make land-grant institutions like UConn a better place for Native and Indigenous students. Already the recipient of many national awards and co-founder of several Native American and Indigenous student organizations on the UConn campus, Sage plans to pursue a law degree and a master's in American Indian Studies to work towards equitable solutions for Native and Indigenous youth to access higher education. We'll also be hearing from Mixashawn Rozie. He's a local Indigenous artist who has been practicing multi-disciplinary and internationally acclaimed jazz for the past 3 decades. He uses ancient cultural principles, maritime arts, and historical data, both written and oral, to inform and guide his art. He is the author of Indigenous Roots of Social Evolution, a compact guide to Connecticut's Indigenous people, their history, their relationship to regional natives, and their impact on the modern world. It can be purchased on Amazon. Mixashawn holds a degree in History and Ethnomusicology from Trinity College. So Sage, thank you so much for being here. Would you like to start?
Yes, thank you. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Happy to be here. Honored to be here and speaking alongside Mixashawn. Super cool opportunity, and thank you again for having me. Good day, Louise. No child, panawáhpskewi, Wabanaki, Kachiwiliwini, Kachiniwes, Kachiwiliwini, Butch, Kachiwiliwini, Scott, Lana. Hi, I just told you that my name is Sage. I'm a member of the Penobscot Nation with homelands in what we currently know as the state of Maine. We are also the Wabanaki people, and I also just paid homage to my family. I introduced myself acknowledging my family and all that they've done for me. They are a part of who I am, as well as my culture. So I am Penobscot through my father's side, acknowledging my grandfather, Butch, who has taught me everything I practically know about my culture, and is an elder in our community that a lot of us look up to. Also my parents, Scott and Lana, who have helped me through everything. Wanted to acknowledge them as well. I am also joining everyone from Nipmuc and Mohegan territories. I am on the UConn campus right now, but I encourage you all to take this time to bring awareness to which lands you are joining from as well. I think that's always really important and an essential thing to do and bring awareness. I also want to acknowledge that the way in which I just introduced myself is in Penobscot, but it is a broken It is my own broken version of the language. As you know, as youth, we're really trying to reclaim our language, and we a lot of the times we pick up on how it's spoken in the home, which is not always, it's not widely spoken the way our ancestors once did, because there was a time in which they were not allowed to. So we are working to reclaim our language and our culture and our history. And I also just wanted to bring awareness to that as well. So with that said, just talk a little bit about being Indigenous in Connecticut. And as I mentioned, I'm not originally from Connecticut. I don't claim to be affiliated with any of the tribes in Connecticut, though I have been fortunate enough over my past 4 years at UConn to develop relations and relationships with local tribal members and elders and youth and fellow college students, which has been an amazing opportunity. So I guess I'll start a little bit about where I came from, and then hopefully that will help to understand how I got to where I am today here as a student in Connecticut. So as I mentioned, I grew up in the state of Maine, traditional Wabanaki territory. Didn't grow up on the res, but I grew up slightly off. My school system was predominantly white, as well as the town that I was growing up in. And, growing up Penobscot, we weren't necessarily taught that we existed in the classroom, which when you went home as a Indigenous youth, that kind of really contradicted everything you thought you knew. So it was a struggle growing up, being Native and one of few Natives in the school, let alone the classroom. And then when I got to high school, our high school used to be the Indians, and it had rid itself of the name. It got rid of the name close to 20 years before I entered those halls, and I still lived the negative repercussions that Native mascots have on us, Native youth especially. I'm sure you're all thinking, I don't have the darkest hair, the darkest skin, and a lot of my classmates thought that too. And I just want to reiterate that we are still here and we look different than the the typical stereotypes that have been, bestowed upon us by non-natives. So as I went through high school, small town, didn't have a large Indigenous community in the classroom, and that was something I felt like I was missing. So I started looking into colleges and, where was I going to go? I'm sure everyone here, when we look at college, we all have a list of requirements or things we want to see at the college we're attending. And I only had one, and that was Native community. That was the only thing I was looking for. I didn't care how far or close to home. I preferred to get away from home a little bit just because I knew everyone. I didn't want to go to the University of Maine. It would have been like going to high school again. So I did some fly-in programs with Native communities. One of them being Dartmouth College, which, if anyone doesn't know, Dartmouth has a very strong Native community. And I got really eager. I was excited to learn, which was something that I couldn't always say confidently growing up, K-12 education. So as I got looking into colleges, UConn came up maybe once or twice in the conversation, and I only could find a picture of the Native American Cultural Programs logo. There was, a largely outdated website for the programs, and as a youth seeking a Native community at a higher education institution, that did not scream anything of that sort to me. So I immediately just said, all right, UConn's, off the list. And it was actually, my mom kept saying, UConn's such a good school, which I really, I wasn't concerned how good the school was deemed to be. I was concerned how the Native community was. So it was my dad who stepped in. And my dad is a man of few words, big Penobscot guy, man of few words. And he actually stepped in and he said, well, why don't you take this opportunity to build that community at a place that, might use a little help? And that really stuck with me because, a man who he doesn't say much often, but those are some powerful words. And I kind of sat on the idea for a while, and I kept coming back to it, and I was like, no, I'm going to go somewhere with the Native community. That's going to be hard. and to build. And then I finally one night we sat back down and he just kept saying, so, what are you thinking? What are you thinking? And it ultimately came down to, why should I be able to benefit off a large Native community when I know what I want in a Native community? I know what's the aspects that have been absent in my own life of a strong Native community in the classroom. I had my tribe, I had the res that I could go to, but in the classroom, I felt like I needed that community in order to succeed to the best of my ability. So I said, all right, I'll go for it. And I committed to UConn before I hadn't visited the school. I didn't really know much about it. All I knew of UConn, everyone kept saying, oh, you playing basketball at UConn? Like, people would joke about that, obviously, but I didn't really know much. I came in here and I basically blindsided myself, but I'm very glad I did. So I got to school here in Connecticut, and I went to the involvement fair at UConn. And I didn't see much. I was just looking for, any Native table, anything. And I found it. I found the Native American cultural programs, which, looking back, was that one picture I could find of UConn and the Native community here. And they told me to go to craft night. And in my head, I was like, well, what's going on at craft night? Because we oftentimes see that our traditions are appropriated. And so I was a little wary, so I didn't get involved. Come the spring of my freshman year, I got a job at the Native American cultural programs. And all I'd kept saying to my connections that I was making is, I want to do the work. Book club and other programming, maybe not craft night, but other programming is great. But I want to do the work. I want to develop this program. I'm not sure if anyone's aware, but UConn currently has 5 cultural centers and 2 cultural programs. So we have different resources, a different amount of staff and students at the programs as compared to the big cultural centers that have been around for a while. And that really bothered me, because UConn has a land acknowledgement that acknowledges that we're on the lands of, but not limited to, 7 tribal nations. So it really bothered me that this institution, occupying many territories, many Indigenous territories, wasn't putting in the work for the Native students. And just to put that into perspective a little bit more, our office is in a closet, a storage closet it was a storage closet that belonged to another cultural center, and they gave it up so that we could have an office in there. And so that was what I came into. And so I have spent, the last few years just tirelessly trying to get us in front of administration, in front of our Office for Diversity and Inclusion. We've also been building relations with the surrounding local tribal communities, whether it's through our youth mentorship program, whether it's through our powwow that we host in the spring, you name it. But I'm a big believer in representation. And one thing I started to realize in my work was that back home and here, there's kind of a joint understanding in the dominant society that we don't exist. People would look at me when I first started working with NACP and say, no, you're just kidding. Like, you're not actually Native. Or what's your blood quantum? How much Penobscot do you claim to be? FYI, don't ask people that. So that it's a hard conversation to hear, though, in all seriousness. It's not, none of us like to be asked how much, quote, Indian we are. Very harmful. And it's, it just makes us feel dehumanized. So I was getting this sense in Connecticut, but also I could relate it back to my experience in Maine. And so what I kept saying to myself was, I just got to keep going. I want to make sure that I'm building a better future for students who decide to come to UConn, Indigenous students who pick UConn. I want to make sure some of the stuff that's happening to me doesn't happen to them, which of course can't be promised, but it can be attempted to prevent it. So I always carry a sense of, I'm always concerned and looking out for our future ancestors or our youth. That's really where I center my focus in my work. So as I got going and NACP was picking up momentum, I started to really look into, what does it mean for UConn to be a land grant institution? Especially being in Connecticut. I'm not sure if anyone's aware of land grant institutions, but basically land grant institutions exist because of the Morrill Act, which really helped contribute to a large theft of Indigenous lands, largely out west, so that land grant institutions today could exist. So it's interesting. It was interesting being in Connecticut because you have Yale, who used to be Connecticut's land grant, and now it was passed over to UConn later on. So just combating these histories and trying to understand them, because I acknowledge that I am a guest on these lands, but how can I help bring awareness to these histories? How can I help develop that better future for our youth? So I was actually involved with Judy in a statewide coalition to ban the use of Native mascots. And that was one of the first projects that I was invited to be involved in. And Maine was actually the first state in the nation to ban the use of Native mascots. And that happened my freshman year of college. So I was not home to witness that, but I watched family members create that change. And I really wanted to take part in that here. So I started off with the mascot group, and then I started applying for other things. So I applied for a grant through the university that allowed me to get a team together in collaboration with UConn's Greenhouse Studios, so that we could delve into this history of UConn as a land grant and where these lands came from. So that we worked on that for the duration of the year. If anyone's interested, landgrabct.org. That's our final product. For now, anyways, there might be more coming. But I was finding ways in which I could get not only my story out there, but my story, the stories of our youth, of the students here in Connecticut struggling in higher education institutions, students that are struggling to feel like they exist, feel like they are heard, and feel like they are valid. And I've been very fortunate to be in conversation with folks at Quinnipiac and Yale. Yale, as some of you may know, has a pretty big Native community, and we've been super grateful to work with them in the past. But also we acknowledge that our relatives at Quinnipiac too are facing a lot of the same struggles. And I don't want to discount that Yale does not. We all have these struggles in higher ed. It's hard enough being Indigenous in higher ed, but we come together and we create a sense of youth community. And I'd like to think that's the community that, senior year high school Sage once sought to have in higher ed. So it's been coming together with those people. It's been a pretty full circle moment, but I'm very fortunate for the opportunities to do this work here. And I'm not sure I envision myself in Connecticut forever. I guess that's not something I've really thought about. But working with Indigenous people and students and fellow future ancestors here in Connecticut has given me a sense of, wherever I end up, I want to bring this work with me. And I essentially learned how to do it here alongside some pretty cool people. So that's been, all the more worth it. And it's been super rewarding. And as Judy said, I have received a couple of pretty cool awards. But, I don't like to say that my name is on them. I think they're for the future ancestors. So I just want to thank everyone for having me here today and allowing me to share my story and my perspectives. And again, just please, keep us in mind throughout this Native and Indigenous Heritage Month. And yeah, Kachiwaliwini, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sage, for sharing your personal story and also for all the amazing work that you've done. And for taking time, you're busy. I know you're very busy, and for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk to us. We really all appreciate it. And those of you in the audience, I was a little bit incorrect when talking about the chat. So you are able to read the chat, but not write into it. So Lisa put in the website for the land grab CT that that Sage was just talking about. So feel free to copy and paste that. It's amazing. It's an amazing app. I've looked through it, and she and her team did a really great job. So next we're going to move to Mixashawn. Mixashawn, hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Don't forget to unmute.
Can you hear me now? Hello?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay, great. Great. Well, first of all, it's an honor being here with everyone, and it's great to hear what Sage had to say. Determined young woman. I'm glad to see she's out there working for the people. I'm going to talk a little bit about, there are two, unfortunately, Connecticut is a classist state, and not just in Connecticut, but many other places. And seems to be two classes of Indians in Connecticut. And when I say two classes, it used to be when I was younger, we were all Indians, everybody knew each other, and that was that. But now, since federal recognition has come to 3 of the tribes, and now only 2 remain because one was kicked off, but I'll get into that a little bit later. There's oftentimes the Native people in this state who are indigenous to this state, who are not on the federal rolls, are often overlooked or bypassed, and it's a double, like Sage had mentioned. They don't think, you're kidding, Indians are gone. Well, it's even double for those who are not recognized, because I remember back in 1980s, I was good friends with a Wabanaki young man, Beaver Wolf was his name, and he was describing to me how, when the federal suit came in 1980, when they had the agreement that the Penobscots and the Passamaquoddy got, the Wabanaki were pretty much left out of it. And I'm mentioning this because a lot of us here in Connecticut and throughout the Northeast and many parts of this country, we're Algonquin people. The people up in this whole region that we call New England, it's all Algonquin speaking people. And, there's different dialects of it, certainly, but just like we have different dialects when we speak English. If you're from Massachusetts, you speak one way. If you're from New York, you speak another way, but, we speak the way we speak here in Connecticut. Some people say we have an accent, others don't. But the point of what I'm saying is, what I'm going to concentrate is, I come from a community that became known as the Windsor Indians. And the original name of Windsor is Pequannock, or Village by the Water. And Pequannock has always been a crossroads because the original name of Bridgeport is Pequannock. There are Pequannocks throughout Connecticut and New Jersey and New York and Long Island. And all of these Pequannocks are connected by water. All of them can be reached to this day by canoe. And what I'd like to talk a little bit about is how, because we often have this class system that unfortunately we've inherited from European colonialism amongst ourselves, because while many people are open, greet their relatives, their neighbors with open arms, there are many that don't. And I think it's important to realize here in Connecticut, we are really at the heart of how Native people were conquered intellectually. It's like we've all heard that story, The Last of the Mohicans. And, The Last of the Mohicans, you think about that. What could be a more effective way of genociding people besides actually killing them is just saying you don't exist. And that's part of what we're going through right now, those of us in Connecticut who are indigenous, who are not recognized by the federal or state government. And it's not just happening in Connecticut, it's all over. I know California, for instance, has lots and lots of people who are not recognized in a semi-state of recognition with the state and the federal government. And this is an issue that, Native people, I think it's important that we deal with this, because all this comes back to colonialism, imperialism, because we're imitating the class structure of those who classified and subjugated us. And I just wanted to get that out of the way, because coming from the community I come from, known as the Windsor Indians, that's always been a community where we had people from all over this region live together and work together. We didn't necessarily go for, the government recognition because we didn't really feel that was important. But it's affected us. So before I go on, I'm going to just talk a little bit about the history of Connecticut and just a quick overview. But before I do that, I just want to explain that everything that I'm going to be saying is not necessarily going to be in words. So before I get into the worded explanation, I'm going to put a circle around us, and then I'm going to talk about how Native people here in Connecticut were connected to this whole region we know as New England and the tri-state area. And when you think of people from Connecticut or Quantuckwa, you have to really think of us as people who are connected by this river that still connects us today. And because we're connected to the river, we have always had great relationships with our relatives, the Nipmunks and the Wampanoags and, Shinnecock and Pontoc. And of course, before I even get into that, we all know that Pequot is a name that is really misunderstood because the Pequot started out as Mahikanu and the Mohicans started out as Pequots. But it's and I bring these up, I don't want to sound quizzical or, nebulous, but the fact is we are so completely misunderstood that it's important to keep those things in mind, because the colonizers of Connecticut realized the importance of the river. And that's why they named this colony after the river, because it is central. And this was the corn trade was something that was very important in even establishing Connecticut as a colony back in the 1630s, because up to that time, the colonies in what is now Massachusetts and Plymouth and the Bay Colony and what's now become New York City or New Amsterdam, those were the first two areas that there was massive migration from Europe, and they established themselves as points of power. But by the 1630s, the early 1630s, Connecticut was really largely not unaffected, but unoccupied by large numbers of Europeans. And there's a reason for this. The reason being that our geography, the river that this whole place is named after, is the main artery that connects this land, this great river land we call Connecticut. Well, 6 months out of the year, the river is impassable. And throughout the year, because it's so hilly and mountainous surrounding Connecticut and is full of Native people who by the early 1630s were extremely hostile to European expansion because they saw what happened to their relatives. We know exactly what was going on in what's now New York and what's now called Massachusetts. We felt some of the effects of it, but we didn't feel the massive effects until the colony was established. And one of the main reasons they established the English established a fort up here, because the Dutch were already here, was for the corn trade. The corn trade was very important, and I'm bringing that up because Connecticut has always been a central point for economic development in the ancient world and the colonial world, and now in the modern world. Connecticut has always been forefront. It's no coincidence that we built some of the greatest seagoing vessels in the world, because we had some of the greatest canoe makers in the world, because all of the shipyards that not in Connecticut, but throughout the Northeast, they've always had Native craftsmen who worked in those yards. I've known a few of them in my lifetime. And there's a history to it, but I don't have time to go into that. But what I do have time to talk about is being a native in Connecticut. We're faced with this. I don't want to call it a problem, but it's a mystery because, as I said earlier, the fact that, most just generally people don't want to believe Native people are still alive, especially in the Northeast, but in Connecticut, especially. And the what I'd like to talk about, for instance, I'll give you an example. For instance, there was a national Native American conference held in Hartford about I'm not sure it was 2 or 3 years ago, but it was held at the in downtown at the convention center. And they had Native people from all over the country come. And I didn't even know about this until the last day it was happening, or the day before it was over. And I only found out that through Facebook because somebody I know was drumming there from Massachusetts, said, hey, there's a conference going on. And when I got there, people were very friendly, very open. It was great meeting the Native people from all over the country, but I didn't see anybody from Connecticut unless they were federally recognized. And I saw very few of them on top of that. And I'm bringing this up again because, as I started earlier, it says there are two classes of Indians here in Connecticut. And I want to bring this to your attention because, for instance, when there's something going on in Connecticut or in Hartford, especially, there oftentimes people will look to other tribes, except the people who live right here in Hartford. Now, I've been involved in the movement to find out what to do with the statue of Columbus, and of course, that's been a very controversial subject because I can just tell you, in dealing with it, there were just 2 Native people on the board that was dealing with this issue, and there was sometimes most of the people would be in agreement, but there were definitely elements of the Euro-American community that were extremely hostile to even telling the true history of Columbus. And this hostility and these problems that we run into all the time are omnipresent. I'm very happy that I've been involved in changing the so-called Columbus Day holiday into Indigenous Peoples Day. And I'm happy to say that this year, finally, for the first time, Hartford Council, passed a resolution that Indigenous Peoples Day is now the new name of the former Columbus holiday. So there's progress that we make, but the real progress we have to make is within our minds. And being within our minds, the misunderstood history of Connecticut's people. Like, for instance, in the old times, there were people, and they know this from not only just what I'm saying and what I've heard from oral histories, but also scientifically speaking. For instance, there's mounds of clam shells, quahog shells, in what's now called Rocky Hill. And that's up the Connecticut River, like maybe about 10 miles outside of Hartford, not even. And they said, gee, how did these shells get there? The shells got there because people would routinely go between this part of Connecticut and to Long Island and into the shore in canoes or Mishoon, and not only do trade and fishing with the people, but they'd also intermarry the people. And there was a lot of, that's why the community I come from, called the Windsor, that became called the Windsor Indians, from the place that is originally called Pequannock, and parts of it are still called Pequannock. We've always had great relationships with our neighbors. So when those times came for first, colonial recognition, and then state recognition, and then later on federal recognition, we were really kind of left out of that because many of us were related to other peoples. Like, for instance, in my particular case, my father comes from the community, the Windsor community, and he's Mahikanu and Mohawk. And I just actually found out through DNA, Mongolian as well. But Sage brought up a point that people say, oh, you don't look like the typical Indian. And that's just another level of just just ignorance that people pursue. For instance, I was in Germany one time and doing some music. Been there a number of times, but one time I was there and this woman came up to me, this German woman, and she said, "Are you Native American?" I said, "Yeah." She says, "Well, you don't look Native American." I said, "Really?" She says, "Yeah." I said, "Well, wait, let's take time out for it. You don't look German." She said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "You don't have blonde hair. You don't have blue eyes. I thought Germans had to have blonde hair and blue eyes. What are you talking about? How are you going to judge me?" And, just getting right to the point of that, I think it's important that we do this when people ask, what percentage are you? Well, you can come back to them and say, what percentage are you? Who are you? Who made you the judge of who you're going to classify people as? I mean, Native people in this country are the only people who have to prove who they are. It's really quite sad that, we come to the point that our tribal ID cards, our plastic ID cards are what defines us as human beings, or as gives us status, so to speak, which is thrown around a lot, status, as an Indigenous person. I've even heard Native people go, my own Native people go as far as say, well, the only person who is allowed to touch eagle feathers is a Native American who has an identification card. And these kind of thoughts are, I'm going back and forth between these things because these thoughts of these thoughts of oppression, repressing thoughts of oppression, continue in the minds of Native people, us, and also in the greater mind of just the people in general. And what's important to understand that as Native people, much of what we have here as our so-called American heritage and culture is so deeply rooted in Native people. Native people have been, I think Rolling Thunder is an elder that passed away a number of years ago. He had a great quote. They asked him, "What is it that you like the most about America?" And he thought for a moment and he said, "Everything the white man has stolen." And that statement has a lot of meaning, because it's not, although it sounds comical and maybe some people might say sarcastic at first, when you stop and think about it, much of the language that we call English or American English is rooted in Native American words. They've been incorporated into, it just goes, I'm not a linguist, but we all know, just even the state we're living in is a mispronunciation of Quantuckwa, Connecticut, Massachusetts. There's so many things, canoes, hammocks. There's so many things that Native people have given us and that we don't really understand. When I say we, the greater culture doesn't understand. And I think it's extremely important for us to get to this, because one of the reasons why there's so much disunity here in this United States, around the world too, but in the United States, is because people are under a great confusion as to who they are and how we evolved to get here. Because if you think that Native people had nothing to do or are gone, that disappeared from the scene and have nothing to do with what's going on right now, you're misinformed. And we have millions and millions of misinformed people. It's gotten to the point where we don't even believe, what's the news that comes on television, the fake news. These are things that are all connected, and they get right back to that very simple thing of classism that this country has been built on in this colonial times that we've evolved into in modern times. And getting back to the Indigenous way of looking at things, we understand that we always talked about the people. We never talked about a race. There's only one race, the human race. But how people look is just another way of classifying and de-recognizing them. And I just wanted to speak just very briefly on this issue of de-recognition. You have 5 state-recognized tribes in Connecticut, and there are different communities. The community I come from, there's a community that's around Middletown, Wonkunks, who are still active and doing things. There are people who, even within communities of the federally recognized Pequots, and Mohicans who are still fighting for the recognition within that tribe, those different tribes. But that's another issue, and I'll let them fight that out. But the reality is, we, as we've divided each other and subdivided ourselves into these different things, it's affected us. And as I was saying earlier, there are now 2 tribes in Connecticut that are federally recognized, but there were 3. There's the Pequots, the Mohicans, the Mashantucket Pequots, and then the Eastern Pequots got their recognition. They're the 3rd ones to get it. And I take that back. And there's also the Schaghticoats also had federal recognition for a short time. Both the Eastern Pequots and the Schaghticoats had their federal recognitions yanked back. They were derecognized, which is a Connecticut word, but it describes exactly what's going on with us. Derecognition. That derecognition process is tough, and it's really something that hurts people, not only for Native people who are affected directly in that, but just people in general. Because as I said earlier, this affects how we even look at reality. People are unable or unwilling to recognize facts that are put right before their eyes, and they refuse to look at reality as it is. And the only thing I can say about Native culture that I think could really help us, one thing I could say is that, it teaches you to just look around you and look at the natural elements that you're surrounded by, and try to live within the boundaries, not even the boundaries, but with those natural elements in a good way. And that's what I think we're so far from. So I don't know if I've used up all my time, but I'm going to leave you with this thought. And the thought is that as Native people, we look at the world sometimes, I know I do, and other people I know, we've talked about this. We look at the world the way that you look at science fiction. You look at this world and, you think about what could happen in the future. Well, Indigenous people, we've seen what happens in the future. We know, and from our own oral histories, which are extremely important, no matter what the books say, the oral histories of how we were up and taught to understand things around us has been the main thing that has guided me. And sometimes it's collaborated, with things that I read, but it's very important to understand that. So I'm going to put this cycle around us, and the thought I want you to think about is that, what is science fiction? What does that mean? Why do we even have science fiction? In Native culture, there's not even a word for fiction, but we seem to be surrounding ourselves with thoughts of the future to take us out of the present, when the fact is we've seen the future with that kind of thinking and what it does to us. So I hope you keep that in mind as I play this. I just wanted to mention to you that if you liked any of that music, we're coming out with a new album in the next month or two, Rock Steady Resurrection, because that's what culture is. That's what life is about, resurrection. And resurrection is as sure and rock steady as the day and the night comes. So that's what I have to say. And I'll turn it back over to those in charge.
Thank you so much, Mixashawn. So you have both given us so much to think about. I invite all of you in the audience to submit any questions or comments in the Q&A box. I do want to say, while you're thinking about what kinds of questions you might have, listening to both of what you have been talking to us about, I just want to say on a personal note, and Sage, thank you for thanking your ancestors. I'm deeply sorry that the US federal government has not only have they created a lot of problems now with the whole crazy recognition process that Mixashawn was talking about, but they have not done anything in an attempt to reconcile or to have a truth and reconciliation project, any kind of apology. And on behalf of my ancestors, so both sides of my family, my ancestors go back to Plymouth, to the Puritans, and I want to apologize to you and your ancestors for the things that my ancestors did, and I'm deeply sorry for that. And one of my questions that I'd like to ask you, after I look at some of the questions other people have posted, is, as an ally, how can I help to support your communities and try and make up for some of the terrible things and injustices that have been done over the centuries? So we have a question for Sage. She wants to know, just confirming that you're in college right now? Yeah, okay, thank you. There's another question for both Sage and Mixashawn. What do you feel is the future of the current land acknowledgement movement? Is it leading to something more than words on white people's papers? So I know Mixashawn has something to say about that, and I'm sure Sage does too. So Sage, you want to start?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I can speak on behalf of my own research and what we've done at LandGrabCT, but just to give a little bit of perspective, like for UConn's current land acknowledgement, we acknowledge the tribes and nations whose lands the institution physically sits upon, which, don't get me wrong, it's very important. It's very important land acknowledgement. I want to point out that we sometimes criticize land acknowledgements for being empty if the institution who has accepted the land acknowledgement and has promised to use it does not fulfill its duties and responsibilities to the Native community at that institution. So one thing LandGrabCT has been looking at doing, which hopefully will be finalized by the end of the week actually, is extending our land acknowledgement to also include the names of the tribes, nations, and peoples whose lands were stolen and expropriated in order to benefit UConn and allow it to stand where it stands and occupies the lands it does today. So that's kind of my perspective on that. In terms of the broader scale, I mean, I think just an acknowledgement of the land is always important to us, and I think the more that we put it out there, the more we acknowledge our lands, the more people understand that we are still here. And I think that's representation is, one of the most important things to us as Native people is, and it's hard that we have to get that message out there that we still exist and that we still are here today. But I think for me, that's one of the most important things. I'll turn it over to Mixashawn.
Yeah, well, yeah, you're right. A lot of these land acknowledgements sound great on paper, and people are doing that, to acknowledge the crimes of the past. But really, I mean, land acknowledgement is good. It's a good step. But I think not just the land, we should acknowledge, people. The land is one thing, because oftentimes in land acknowledgements, they'll say, well, the people who once lived here and whose lands, they once occupied, we're still here. And acknowledging the people, I think, once it would be a very big step in doing this, because of course land is important, but we're people acknowledging land. Why not start with acknowledging people? And I think that this attitude, and oftentimes it's well-meaning, we got to get out of this state of mind that people are completely extinct. Yes, we're reduced in numbers. Yes, we don't look the same. Yes, we've intermarried. Yes, our culture has oftentimes has been taken away from us, and we haven't been able to maintain it. But we still have maintained community. The people still exist there, and I think it's very important to start shifting that focus into acknowledging the people who are actually here. Because when you get into just purely a land acknowledgement, by definition, you're just going to be dealing with the people who have title on the colonial records, who quote unquote own the land, or whose lands they were. And while that's important, I think we have to take a step further and humanize it.
Yeah, thank you. And I know when you came to talk to a group of us at University of Hartford, Mixashawn, you educated me about a whole nother aspect, which is that it gets into your discussion of classism, that the people often who get acknowledged, or even the communities that get acknowledged in the land acknowledgement, are the ones that are federally recognized or state recognized, right? And it's not encompassing all of the natives who are still living on this land. And to your point, Sage, when I was talking to one of the people at UConn who was involved in the land acknowledgement process, and he was explaining how they deliberately chose tribes that live today as opposed to the ones from before, to try and counter that whole narrative of everyone is extinct. It's like, these are the tribes that are living here right now, even though they might, well, UConn has a big footprint, so they're all throughout the state, so they could pretty much, the tribes they are acknowledging who are living here today are within UConn's jurisdiction. But I think your next step is really an important one, to also include the tribes and lands of the people that were involved in the land grab. So yeah, very interesting. We would like to get a land acknowledgement for University of Hartford, some of us who are working here, but it's tricky to do it in a way that's authentic and not hollow. So thank you for your input. So I have another question, is kind of connected on this whole question of representation and mascots that, Sage, you were talking about, the mascot work we've been trying to do in Connecticut, and West Hartford, we had our own version of that 5 or 6 years ago. And a lot of people who wanted to keep the Native American mascots use this idea of representation, saying, at least you have the names out there, and if you do away with a mascot, then it'll contribute to even a greater sense of extinction. And so I'm just wondering what your response is to that argument.
Yeah, I think Mixashawn said it perfectly earlier. We are the only people that have to prove who we are. And in doing that, in the federal government, putting that responsibility on us, it is unfair to us as Native people that non-natives get to call themselves quote unquote Indians without any negative repercussions. When they do it, it's seen, when they do it through the mascots, it's seen as, school pride or school spirit. And for us, we're half the battle. Most of the battle is proving that we still exist and that we are here. So I would say that's the biggest struggle. And, I always, to people that want to keep these mascots, I always confront them with the question, would you put any other racial, ethnic, or religious group as a school mascot. And, think about other identities who are in your presence every day. Would you use any other group other than Native people as a mascot? And every time I've asked that question, I write a lot of letters that, get sent to various towns in Connecticut, and that question is always in it. And it catches people off guard. They just don't think of it like that. So it's hard that it's upon us to explain why the mascots don't honor us. And there was a Mohegan elder who spoke in one of my classes the other day, and she said it perfectly. She said, I'm offended by the mascots, and I'm offended that people have to ask me why I'm offended by the mascots. So I think that was the perfect way of putting it. But yeah, I hope that answers that.
Yeah, thank you. Mixashawn, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I think pretty much covered it. I mean, it's demeaning.
Yeah.
It's something that, there's a young woman, well, she's not that young anymore, Asipa Tupahachi, a Matinecock woman. Now she's an elder like I am, out in Long Island. She wrote a little compact book that blew my mind back in like the early 1980s. It's called Taking Another Look. And she was just talking about how, the mascots are just the barometer of how misinformed and racist the society is. I mean, if we take the mascots away, that's a good first step, but there's just so much more. There's so much more.
Definitely, which both of you have explained so eloquently. So just a pitch to all of you out there in the audience, Connecticut still has between 10 and 15 schools that have Native mascots. We've been trying to eliminate them through various ways, statewide, community-wide, town, in terms of focusing on the town. If you want to get involved in that work, it's out there. So you can pitch in. And we just have 3 minutes left. So I'm just going to ask each of you, this is a hard question, but maybe you could just give an answer, a way you could suggest for those of us who want to be allies, how we can be good allies. How about start with you, Mixashawn, and then Sage?
Yeah. Well, doing the things that you're doing now, that's good. And as an artist, I can only speak, as an artist, hire Native people, hire Native artists. And not just people who are, traditional artists, that's great, but there's a lot of contemporary artists. There's a lot more contemporary artists than you might think. They were just starting to come to the forefront because our culture is alive. And so I would say the best thing you do is keep your mind open, and, the arts are extremely important, even though I hate that word art, because art is just a class that was created before they had artists. Everybody was an artist. It was no big deal. Do you expect it to be beautiful? That's not a question. So support Native artists. That's what I would say.
Great, thank you. Sage?
Yeah, I would say, Judy, you're doing it right now. You're giving us a platform to share our stories and amplify our histories and just, reiterate that we are here. I think that's a lot of it. I will say, allow us to speak for ourselves, I think is really important. And I think where oftentimes people try to speak for us, whether it's not intended to come across that way or not. You'd be surprised how far one misconception of our cultures can carry across. And it always comes back to harm us in one way or another. And half the harm there is just having to, squash the misconception ourselves. It should not be our duty to do so. But, as Native people, we kind of feel that we are burdened that it is. So I would just say representation, let us tell our stories, and just try to adopt things into your everyday life that acknowledge we are here. It can come in many forms, but yeah.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, both of you, Mixashawn and Sage, and also to our co-sponsors and to our audience. Thank you for tuning in today. So bye-bye, everyone.